Greetings viewers, just want to do a very quick video about my next project that I'm starting. Just finished one of the volumes of my project on history, Meditations on Geopolitics. The previous volume covered the period from 1860 until 1914, and the next one, volume 6, is going to be on the period 1914 to 1945. So it's essentially the period of the two world wars and all of the incredibly violent, deeply fratricidal, in some cases atrociously awful, in other cases remarkably hopeful events between the bookends of the world wars. It was the Turkish Civil War, the Russian Civil War, the Chinese Civil War, the rise of massed anti-colonial movements, a whole range of complex factors, the expansion of the 1920s, the emergence of the United States as the largest single economy on the planet, then the catastrophe of the Great Depression, and then the Second World War. So my thinking about World War I actually came late to the issue of World War I, and it's an interesting story. To this day, the issue of how World War I starts remains one of the live wires. It's like the old standby. If you need an argument amongst a bunch of historians, just throw that question out and you'll get a whole variety of different responses, because it's such a complex event, and that period of history between 1914 and 1945 is so incredibly complex, and we don't have good models for understanding it to this day, which is one of the reasons I'm writing my text. My own argument is that 1914 was the beginning of a very interesting change in world history, and there is something important and unique about World War I, and that was its status as a kind of a global event. So I'll come back to that in just a sec. I'm not saying that events prior to 1914 were not global or planetary. They were, but they didn't have the same significance, they weren't organized in the same way, and they didn't have the systemic effects of the conflict of 1914, 1918. My own thinking on this goes back to the moment in the mid-2010s when I ran across a wonderful essay from which I continue to learn from by one of the great historians of our time, Paul W. Schroeder, who by irony of fate actually taught at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, my alma mater, where I did my work in communications, got my degree working on a dissertation on video game culture, graduated in 2012. I never took a class from him. I think he'd retired by the time I was a student there. But all of his essays were online, and he's regarded as the sort of the doyen of the folks that write diplomatic history of Europe, and particularly of the modern early 20th century Europe. And he wrote an amazing essay about the start of World War I, arguing that most folks took the problem of how did World War I start in the wrong way. And his point is, it wasn't the start of a war, which we need to explain. What we need to understand is why it was the end of a long period of peace in European history, and that period of peace between 1815 and 1914. Another way of saying that is, why was Britain able to sort of more or less run the world system between 1815 and 1914, and it loses this capacity after that point? What was the process? How did that happen? A lot of my text on the period just prior to World War I, the book that I wrote on 1860 to 1914, which I called Global Steam, in honor of the steam age, because that's what it was, the age of the mechanization of railroads and ships and so forth, invention of airplanes as well, mapped out a lot of those processes, sort of the process of industrialization, the rise of maritime empires, the spread of imperialism, and the gradual erosion of British authority in the late 19th century and the rise of new powers which are competing, most obviously the United States, the German Empire, the Italian Empire, the Japanese Empire, a Russian Empire that sought to expand in certain ways, and on and on and on and on. So I've already talked a little bit about that text in the previous video, but Schroeder's point struck me as very profound, that the notion of this kind of planetary conflict presumes that there aren't planetary conflicts. They're not normal. They don't constantly happen for a whole bunch of reasons. And the reasons are the ways that the British hegemony had structured the world so there wouldn't be those conflicts in the past. And then all of a sudden things happened where the economic, political, cultural opinions of that hegemony all eroded in various ways until conflicts erupt. My point with the volume that I'm writing on 1914-1945 is to flesh out that argument. Schroeder limited his musings on the outbreak of World War I to just that essay, famous essay, and his edited collection, System Stability Statecraft, which is available in most libraries, and I think online as well. Worth reading, relatively short essay, full of insights. But he also leaves something out. And the more I pondered the problem, the more I began to realize we actually need a more complicated and deeper history of that outbreak of war. So one of Schroeder's points is that there's a breakdown in one of the crucial structures of British hegemony, and that's this period of peace. And it's not just yes, there were wars and so forth, but there was a specific location in the planet that did not experience apocalyptic wars between 1790-something and 1914. And that was the border zone between the Austrian, Prussian, German empires. And this is very strange because all those empires were battling and fighting, and there were lots of local small wars. But between 1794 and 1914, those empires, Austria, Prussia, later Germany, and Russia, do not wage war on each other. And yet, by the same token, the pressures are building until some kind of apocalyptic war. When it does erupt, it involves all three and consumes all the land empires. Fall apart in the course of World War I. So this is the paradox. Okay, Schroeder talks about this, but he also leaves out something important about World War I, which would set the stage for World War II. The fact that this event, this World War, was truly planetary. Yes, it starts in Sarajevo with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, a dynastic squabble between an ethnic group and a dynast king, but then it metatizes, metastasizes, like some kind of, goes viral, as we would say in the 21st century. It grows. So there's some latent potential in the system that just kept growing. One of the ways that it grows is that it's not just that truce between the Eastern European and West Asian empires, which collapses in the late 19th century. There's another long piece that collapses, located at the other end of Asia. And that's the sort of inadvertent maritime long piece between the empires of Qing China, Romanov Russia, and Japan. First Tokugawa Japan and later Meiji Japan. So those three empires don't go to war with each other between roughly 1689 and 1895. It just doesn't happen. They don't have the maritime means, and they're concerned with other things, and other processes are happening. So they don't have apocalyptic wars of expansion and colonization vis-a-vis each other. And this suits the British just fine because they rule the planet's oceans. They have a small presence there, and they sort of enforce that peace by controlling the oceans. That truce goes away at the same time. So there's a double breakdown of the peace. It's not just that West Asia explodes in 1914. It's also that really since 1895, when the Japanese Empire attacks the Qing Chinese Empire, starts to take over Taiwan, Korea, etc., the whole Japanese imperialism, which would lead to catastrophe, the Second World War, that truce breaks down too, at more or less the same time. And those breakdowns start to look like the same breakdown. In fact, they start to converge. So what I'm writing about in about 1914 in the current volume is this problem of what does 1914 actually mean? And my argument is that we often think of the First World War in terms of military campaigns and battles. Now that's important. That's a huge part of that history. But it's also important to put those military campaigns, battles, struggles over zero-sum fights between empires in a certain kind of historical context. World War I was also the invention of something radically and dramatically new. It was, in many respects, the very first planetary event. There was really nothing quite like it before then. There were regional events, there were events that had global significance, the fall of Napoleon, the rise of the British, the US Civil War, this terrible civil war of the Tanping Uprising in China, the 1857 uprising in India against British colonial rule. All these had planetary significance, but they weren't planetary events. They were regional events. They would later have aftershocks and events and so forth. And this pattern is true of almost all of the political, leading events of the 19th century. Think of the 1848, 1851 revolutions and uprisings. Yeah, they all take place. That's a planetary wave, but in the end, they're very localized. They have very contingent different outcomes. They're mostly in a certain space, mostly in Europe, though there are aftershocks and comparable events elsewhere in the world system. But they go in very different directions. World War I, on the other hand, was a global event that starts very small and then leaps out in complexity and eventually consumes the entire planet, like some kind of science fiction story of a virus taking over the Earth, or aliens, this unstoppable force taking over the Earth. Very much a metaphor for this. And maybe in some kind of ways, the Hollywood B-grade science fiction films are just their own way. They're kind of a meditation on history. They're sort of a scriptwriter thinking about how do you narrate catastrophe in a new and interesting way that makes a little bit of sense to an individual caught up in this madness. Because it has to have a pattern, but also has to be sort of patternless in order to be frightening. And therefore, so they play with this notion of a causality that's sort of out of control, and a world system which is sort of hostile to us, the observers and participants of world civilization. We're all citizens of the planet, but how many of us actually have actual control of our lives, and what does that really mean? World War I marks that point where something like planetary citizenship is invented in ways that were just not possible because the planet was not industrialized enough, motorized enough, connected enough, mediatized enough, and just flat out capitalized enough prior to 1914 for that conversation to begin to happen. 1914 marks that moment of quantity into quality where something like a conversation starts to happen. And the other side of this is that this moment of history is also when the traditional empires, so the 14 empires that rule 90% of the planet in 1910, one of them, the Qing Empire, falls apart as early as 1911. So there are 13 that start to fight in 1914. 1914 marks the moment that those empires start to tear themselves into pieces, and that massive new forces, the anti-colonial movements, democracy movements, social justice movements, all start to emerge all across the planet and start to fight for a very different set of societies. And they start to fight against empire, against dynastic power, against national imperial power, and freedom to accumulate fortunes in the pockets of a few plutocrats. And they start to argue and fight for something else, a cooperative society where there would be democracy and ordinary people would be taken care of, and there would be a welfare state and healthcare, and education, and housing for everyone. So essentially the beginning of an actual progressive movements on a mass scale. They were there in the 19th century, but they were very local, they were very limited, they were limited to very small spaces. And it's actually extraordinary to see this take place. One of the very symptomatic, not after effect, side effect, but one of the most interesting effects of the wartime mobilizations, 1914, 1918, is that as all the regimes mobilize large numbers of soldiers for mass violence, they also have to give those soldiers buy-in. They can't just treat them like nothing, like dirt. You're arming them, you're giving them these reasons, you're sending them off to die, and that means you have to respond to them as a polity. They become political subjects. So they start to demand things like food and respect and veterans benefits and this kind of thing. And there's a massive transformation. It's also true that after 1914, the democratization of the planet really begins in earnest. There was some democratization, very localized, before then. After 1914, you see this incredible expansion of the franchise. And most importantly, between 1914 and 1920, large numbers of polities, for the first time ever, women win the right to vote in national elections. And that had been the key part of the autocracy of the 19th century, the fact that you could have these democratic elections, but women were not allowed to vote in the national elections. They did vote at local elections, and certain polities, Finland, New Zealand, did grant female suffrage. But this becomes a noticeable trend after 1914. And again, there's this striking, and you look very carefully at this history, and you start to realize one of the things that's happening there is when you send off large numbers of men to the front lines, you have to treat them like political subjects. But large numbers of women enter the workforce for the first time ever. So the rates of participation for female workers go way up in the major combatant nations. Sociologists have documented this. And so there's a revolution and outlook. Women start to work in these industrial jobs and start to think of themselves as political subjects and start to demand the right to vote. And that becomes inevitable. And so even in the United States, 1920, amendment was passed and women win the right to vote. And other European polities, the same thing happens, particularly in the revolutions of 1918. Most of the European countries that go through some kind of massive revolution, downfall of dynastic systems, will have universal suffrage for all citizens, regardless of gender, after 1918. Major change. So these are just a few of the sort of the general patterns that I'm looking at with this particular volume. Then there's the other problem of what do these empires do in response to this sort of wave of popular protest and pressure and democratization? Well, they respond with revanchism, a desire to go back to the past, back to dynastic figures, back to forms of autocracy. And this, of course, is the genesis of the sort of the great wave between roughly 1922 and 1933 of fascism. So the classic European fascism, but also Japanese fascism, also the sort of the semi-corporatist fascisms that emerge all across the semi-periphery, particularly the Central and South American countries, military juntas, dictatorships, and so forth. Brazil, the Estado Novo under Vargas, it's actually a kind of a corporatist fascist state, somewhere between Mussolini's Italy and Salazar's Portugal and other examples elsewhere. The last piece of the puzzle, and I'll end the video here, is the central problem of the 20th century left. What do we make of the Russian revolutions? What legacies do those revolutions and uprisings have for us today? And that's where the pedal hits the metal, where all this trail that I've laid out here from this idea of the truces breaking down, the long peace breaking down, and war erupting, and this crisis of empire and a reconfiguration of empire starts to pay dividends. Because the time has come for us to actually sit back and start to think of the Russian insurrections and revolutions as a series of rebellions against empire, but also as attempts at reconstituting empire. So there's progress and regress. The most interesting forms of progress were maybe the democratic movements of some of the Eastern European countries, and the most interesting regress, Stalinism. Like, why Stalinism? Why did this figure emerge at that time and emerge in that polity? And how did that system work? And how are we to think of it today? How did it influence and had huge influence on the world system? But only certain parts of the world system that were also essentially dynastic societies that ended their dynasties and had to go through industrialization. So the Stalinist model was appropriated and reinvented by many other countries in the course of the 20th century. What are we to make of that? And what's the relationship between Stalinism and this long-term logic of decolonization and the end of empires? Because Soviet empire was an empire, most definitely an empire, but it didn't necessarily follow the rules or the logic of the maritime colonial empires, or of the land empires, or the absolute empires. It was a different beast, different structure, a complex set of contradictions that we need to map out and think about. So I'm not going to excuse a single act of violence by the Soviet Empire. My point is that we actually have to start to think of all of these empires and imperial structures from a planetary standpoint. Then finally we can start to understand what happened and also understand some of our contemporary history. The Russo-Ukrainian War starts to make perfect sense. We just think of this kind of long continuity of Muscovy being this colonial empire. It goes on, it becomes a new empire, and then it becomes a new empire, and it becomes a new empire. And this is, the current version of Muscovy is sort of the third and final of the Russian empires, the oil empire. At limited lifespan, it will clearly fall apart or disintegrate at some point this year or next, at the latest. But at least we can start to understand sort of why it emerged and why it was able to do so much harm to itself and the rest of the world, why it emerged, and what the forces that also emerged to sort of take it apart over time. So what are the forces of democracy and popular resistance, and what future does humanity have if we are going to get beyond empire? And we need to get beyond empire, otherwise we're not going to have a planet. What would that democratic future be? What would that post-colonial but democratic society, where every human being has worth and dignity and a job and housing and human rights and is respected, what would that look like? And then how do we think of empire in that respect? Maybe the answer is we actually have to start to think much more critically of empire as a set of planetary institutions that we have to actually, whose legacy we actually have to fight everywhere and resist everywhere, understand them, and by understanding them, critique them and begin to move beyond them.